It's Analysing Anfield, your tactics and analytics podcast, courtesy of the Blood Red channel. I'm Guy Clarke. Welcome along. Klopp's midfield machine misfires on day one, with Darwin doing the damage off the bench. We'll recap the visit to the cottage. We'll analyse the Reds' burning transfer conundrum before looking ahead to Monday's visit of Crystal Palace. To rule an eye over all of that, crunch the numbers and delve into the data. It's a pleasure, as ever, to be joined by Josh Williams. Josh, I hope that you're well, and the first week of the new season has treated you well.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you look at Liverpool, that was a bit of a shock result, shock performance as well, which I'm sure we'll get into. But if you're referring to fantasy football, then yeah, I'm doing okay. Solid start, steady off the blocks.
Yeah, anything but me. I've been left behind already. Let's before we get into the Liverpool action, let's quickly talk about our fantasy football league. We have set it up. We've got almost 500 of you in there, 483 to be precise. And Josh, after week one, I'm languishing somewhere in 451st, I think, to be precise, is where I am. So, as one of the expert voices on this panel, not a great start.
Well, I think it stems from the captaincy, mate. You've been led by your Arsenal bias as usual. Yeah. That's not the first time, actually, to be honest. Looking at guys' teams over the years, you captained Jesus, I think.
Yeah, I did.
Which didn't go down well when you've got the likes of Erling Haaland and Mo Salah right there. So, yeah, no sympathy, mate. To be honest.
No, I'm sticking with my lads, and I have to say that a lot of my team, I'll get my excuse in early, a lot of my team had away fixtures. So the Arsenal players did start well on the first night, bar Gabriel Jesus, but the rest of them away from home, trickier games. I'm thinking home comforts this weekend. Let's see how they do, if there's any repairable damage to what they did last week, and see if they can prove me right and stay in the team. Otherwise, the changes will be wrong. I don't think there'll be an early wild card, but we will have to wait and see. If you haven't joined the league but are playing FPL, do get involved. The code that we have is 8S72G1. As I say, we're only 17 short of 500 people, so it'd be great to get it up to that number, which already, Josh, has blown us away just how many people are in the league.
Yeah, and I forgot actually that you can still join after the first week, so that's a positive. But I suppose having so many people in the group, I'd be amazed if one of us gets anywhere near the top. I said to Dave last week, there's got to be a few experts in there now. If you're looking at 500 people, that's a huge league. That's a fair amount of people, and some of them will be crunching the numbers to the nth degree. Beyond what we're doing. So it's going to be interesting to see how we all get on. But don't captain Jesus is the lesson of the first week.
Yeah. Lesson well learned for me. But Josh, let's talk about the actual action then. Liverpool starting away at Fulham, another newly promoted side to start the season against, but didn't follow the regular pattern. In the end, held to a draw. And were they lucky to get a draw?
Yes, absolutely horrendous is how I'd put it. It was one of the worst performances I've seen from a Klopp Liverpool team. And what I mean by that, though, is just specific individuals being collectively miles off it. I don't know what it was. It was kind of unexplainable, to be honest. Uncharacteristic of the players. Klopp said after the game that the attitude was wrong, which is unlike him. I read that he didn't hug anyone on his way off the pitch, which sounds like a minor narrative, but when you're talking about Jurgen Klopp, it's not a common theme at all. I don't recall any games where he's made that decision. So it was just an all-round really terrible day, and it's not a good way to start the season, really.
No, definitely not. And I suppose kind of when you do look at it and how Liverpool, I know you were away on holiday through parts of pre-season, but the preparation seemed as though they'd gone quite well. Of course, they had lost to Leipzig during the to Salzburg during the pre-season, but they beat Leipzig very convincingly indeed. Yes, they started against Manchester United in not a great fashion, but that was after literally 3 days on the training pitch for the main international players who had come back into the group. But it felt as though off the back of the Community Shield that actually, despite finishing later than everyone and starting very early indeed this season, that Liverpool had managed again to prepare things correctly. On the day, though, that really just didn't transpire.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wondered whether, have we been drilling this team into the ground to the extent where they're tired? But it didn't feel like a tired performance. It just felt like lackluster. It felt like almost a disinterested performance from certain players. And if you look at the team that Klopp picked, it's probably the team I would have picked. I know there was a bit of controversy around Firmino starting ahead of Nunez. But if you look at Fulham's system, Fulham defending a 4-4-2. So if you're defending the 4-4-2, that number 10 space is going to be opening up. And Firmino naturally drops into those pockets. I thought it was going to cause problems for them. And I thought Nunez would come on and do exactly what he did in the Community Shield, where he makes use of fresh legs against defenders who are going to be tired. And that kind of happened in a way. But the initial first hour, Firmino was miles off it. I thought it was a terrible day for Van Dijk. Trent was miles off it. Jordan Henderson was awful. And just a collect. Even Salah wasn't. I wouldn't say Salah was bad. He was just extremely quiet for the first hour, like unusually quiet though. Where I mean, I have to look at his numbers, see how much he touched the ball, but it felt like he barely did. And whenever he did, he'd be coming backwards. He'd be forced backwards into his own half. Part of that, obviously, you need to credit Fulham with that. I thought Fulham were outstanding. If they play anything like that for the rest of the season, they'll do really well. I thought the new lad,
Paulinho.
yeah, João Paulinho from Sporting, I thought he was very, very good. Mitrovic was an absolute handful. The two fullbacks I thought were very aggressive, very front foot. So, part of it's down to the opposition, but when you look at the players Liverpool have got, you just expected Liverpool to be a bit more bold in certain moments, escape the tight pressure behind them in certain moments. Just never really happened up until about the 75th minute when we started to put a bit of pressure onto Fulham.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the real issues for Liverpool was, and watching it back so evident, was Liverpool couldn't get any fluency going, couldn't get the midfield into the game. And a large part of that for me was the inability to keep the ball and just retain it and keep possession of it. I mean, I've looked through the numbers, and in terms of pass completion, the number in the end for Liverpool was just 78.2%, which all of last season they only had a lower pass completion once, and that was away at Chelsea when Jurgen Klopp wasn't even on the touchline, when they got 74.4% pass completion in that game. Of course, that was a 2-2 draw as well. The
Yeah,
average
I remember
for
that
last
game, yeah.
season, yeah, the average for last season was 83.5% for pass completion. I mean, I think it was only under 80% on what, looking through the numbers here, the 2-2 draw away at Man City, the 2-0 home win, 2-0 away win, sorry, over Brighton, the 2-2 draw I mentioned against Chelsea, the defeat at Leicester, the draw at Tottenham, and that was it for games where the pass completion was under 80% for Liverpool. And it feels as though when that midfield doesn't work and can't keep hold of the ball, it's when the game becomes a lot more open, which is what we saw against Fulham.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, that actually, those numbers that you've just picked up on, because in that game against Chelsea, I distinctly remember that game, and I distinctly remember writing a piece on the back of that, specifically in reference to Henderson and James Milner, who both started that day. I think both players on the day, despite playing in central midfield, I think they both posted pass completions beneath 70%, I think. And Liverpool end up with virtually no control in the game, and it's no shock really, is it, when you think about it? And in this game against Fulham, Milner obviously started on the bench, but Henderson again had another one of those games where he's almost consumed by the chaos. He's a little bit the tempo. The tempo of the game dictates the way he plays rather than the other way around at times. And I must say, watching the game, I thought Fabinho was equally terrible, and I thought Thiago was well off it as well. But then when you actually look at the numbers of the game, Thiago, despite being really, really bad, completed 88% of his passes. Fabinho, again, despite being really, really bad, completed 84% of his passes. Henderson, down at just under 72%. So not quite as bad as his Chelsea performance, But it does seem that when these games happen where the opposition are really, really aggressive, you need to play under pressure, play in tight spaces, keep the ball on the deck because the ball's permanently bouncing all over the place. It feels like Henderson gets a bit consumed in those games. And, you can understand why, but it's just a bit of a negative when that happens. And when everyone looks bad, when you actually look at the numbers, Henderson just looks that bit worse, and that was the case when we looked at the Chelsea game as well.
Yeah, as you say, for the Fulham game, Henderson just under 72% pass completion rate. I mean, Trent Alexander-Arnold was bottom for Liverpool in the end. Only
Yeah.
completed 51 of his 85 passes. I mean, that within the tail there tells you kind of exactly the point we're making, where Trent Alexander-Arnold is such a key player for Liverpool. But more so, it's getting those basic passes intercepted and wrong that then means that there's no fluency that's built up, and Liverpool can't get into their stride in the pattern that they so often demonstrate against newly promoted sides, or against most sides in the league, home or away, where they do just dominate, albeit perhaps not in the manner that Man City do. But once you start to thread those shorter passes together and build that fluency, everything else eventually sort of seems to come together for you.
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to give Trent a little bit of license, considering he plays those high risk, high reward passes almost. So it feels a little bit different with Trent, but nevertheless, I've just looked at last season's numbers, and throughout the whole of last season in the Premier League, his lowest pass completion in any game was 63.8%. So he's obviously posted 60% in his first game this season against Fulham, which is already worse than any game last season. So it really does capture how off it Liverpool were, I suppose. But I think the issue with Henderson is in my opinion, is largely tasked with instigating control in the game and giving Liverpool a foothold. And, pass completion numbers can be deceiving at times, and they don't offer that much value. But I think at the same time, they do offer an insight into the level of control a player has over the ball sometimes. And Henderson's ability to keep the ball in this game is really, really low. And I'll be honest, I saw the the compilation doing the rounds on Twitter. It's bad. It is awful. I mean, it's a case of whenever the ball's coming through in the midfield, it's usually bouncing. And rather than putting his foot on the ball, it's pretty much always a case of Henderson hits that bouncing ball forward towards the opponent's last line, and they usually head it just back in the same direction. But a lot of the time, it's just Henderson kind of like aimlessly hitting the ball forward, lofted passes that don't really go anywhere. I don't want to be too critical on Henderson as an individual, because he was one of the few who played the full 90 minutes, funnily enough, and it was a collectively horrendous performance from everybody. But yeah, it just went a great day.
So we've discussed the lack of control Liverpool had then through the course of the game, and how they struggled to really exert that over Fulham. What about the goals then? Let's analyse the ones that were conceded before we talk about Darwin Nunez and the impact he had coming off the bench. I mean, where are you kind of laying the blame lines in terms of the goals conceded? Obviously, one of them's a penalty, and you said Mitrovic was a handful. He obviously got himself 2 goals, but for the first one, the cross that comes in, maybe more can be done to stop the cross. Maybe the header can actually be stopped as well. But of course, a lot of kind of responsibility has been put at Trent Alexander-Arnold's door again, because he's been beaten under a high ball at the back post.
Well, I'll be honest, I think that one's a little bit harsh. I don't think he paints himself particularly well in the moment, but that is a difficult situation to deal with when it's Alexander Mitrovic who's coming in behind you, who's like 6'3" or 6'2" or whatever. Fair bit of weight on him. Great in the air, very aggressive player, and the ball's hanging up in the air as well. So I actually felt a little bit sorry for Trent there, and I think the large majority of fullbacks in that situation would almost not stand a chance. I do think you can look at Robertson and suggest that he should have stopped the cross, and I think I also would lay a bit of the blame on Alisson's door. Not many people have talked about Alisson in reference to the goal, but I think for me, he should save it. People, long-term listeners of the show will know that I can be quite demanding when it comes to goalkeepers. Alisson is absolutely ridiculous. I've got no issues with him whatsoever. But in that moment, for me, he usually steps up, and if Mignolet does that, I'm all over him. So I have to do it with Alisson as well. So I think that was just all round again a bad goal. But what I did want to touch on though before we touch on anything else is I've just said Liverpool's performance was horrendous and all that sort of stuff, right? But what's interesting is if you actually look at the numbers attached to the game, which obviously we do on this show, it doesn't suggest as much. So the expected goals on the day, Liverpool posted 1.9. That's really not bad. Liverpool's average last season was 2.2 per match, and Liverpool scored 2 goals from that 1.9, which is exactly in line with what you'd expect. Fulham, if you remove the penalty, only generated about 0.6 xG in open play, and most of that was the Mitrovic header from close range. So what I wanted to touch on was, although Liverpool were miles off it is really interesting when you actually look at almost what matters in a game. Shots at one end compared to shots at the other end. Liverpool still generated more than enough to run out winners at the end of the game, and Fulham only generated enough, barely even for 1 goal, never mind 2. So I wrote a piece on it during the week, actually, just kind of like how bad the Liverpool have to be to lose, because Liverpool ended up nearly winning the game.
I take your point, and that was why I kind of started by talking about the pass completion rate, because it felt more, as you said there, from a Liverpool perspective, it was horrendous in that regard of Liverpool shooting themselves in the foot with a lack of control, as opposed to not being able to get out or play because Fulham were all over them. For me, it was a lot of Liverpool's own misgivings that meant that they didn't push the game in the manner that it did. And then that's maybe where you bring in the intangibles of a newly promoted side at home for their first game back in the Premier League. The crowd can maybe get into it, albeit probably not the most raucous of crowds at Craven Cottage. And maybe that's, as I say, where some of those things come into it. Your point about obviously Fulham not creating much when they've got someone who is an elite header of the ball in Alexander Mitrovic, a guy who specialises in first time finishes in a penalty box and doesn't really need much of a sniff at goal. It's kind of, isn't it, situational as to who it is who's having the XG at times. And I know he's not always been a great hit in the Premier League. I think his last season in the division has maybe skewed opinion on him somewhat, where he and Scott Parker just blatantly didn't seem to see eye to eye in terms of what Parker wanted from a forward and what Mitrovic could offer, because the previous time Fulham were in the division and were pretty woeful, he was their saving light. It was just they couldn't get the ball up to him enough, whereas in this game they did. And there was a couple of times where he turned Van Dijk expertly well. He won the penalty, of course, and that's where then obviously the frustrations can come into it for Liverpool. But obviously, whilst Mitrovic shone at one end of the pitch as a goal scoring number 9, Darwin Nunez came on and offered Liverpool something similar. You said you were hoping prior to the game he'd start on the bench, come on and do something similar to what he did in the Community Shield. And I mean, the big debate now, and we'll get into talking about the Palace game, is whether he's already in the Community Shield and now in his first Premier League game off the bench done enough to already be knocking on the door to be a starter.
Yeah, I don't really think you can ignore him, to be honest. I think he's going to be very effective as a late introduction in matches, especially when Liverpool have a lead. That was the topic of my newsletter earlier in the week, actually. Just if you look at Haaland's second goal, for example, against West Ham, City are 1-0 up. West Ham have to chase the game. As a result of chasing the game, they move higher up the pitch, commit more bodies forward, and it's just opened up all kinds of space for Haaland to get them on the break, and he ends up scoring the signature goal. So I think a lot of Nunez's goals will come on the break, late in matches maybe. But despite that, I still think he's done more than enough in his past 2 appearances now to really get an appearance from the start. Massive handful, causes havoc in the box, and despite only being on the pitch for 40 minutes, only 2 players in the league this weekend accumulated more XG, and one of those was Pascal Gross, who obviously dominated Manchester United single-handedly, and the other one was Erling Haaland. Both of them scored 2. But as I said, third on the list was Nunez, despite playing 40 minutes. Fourth on the list is Son Heung-min. Fifth on the list is Martinelli. Sixth on the list is Mohamed Salah. All of those players started, and they all played full 90 minutes except Haaland, who came off on 77 minutes. So, Nunez has just had a massive impact whenever he came on, and Firmino was not great. So, I would have no issues with starting Nunez this weekend. I think it's time for that to happen, and I think considering Thiago's now out as well, which we'll get to, maybe it opens up the possibility of doing a bit more of a switch as well and playing 2 midfielders, playing number 10 behind Nunez, and just kind of keep Nunez in the penalty box for the whole game against Palace, basically.
Well, you saw in the 40 minutes that he played the game exactly what you were sort of saying to expect through the course of the summer. Of he's a guy who just comes on and his sole focus is where are the posts? I'm going to get the ball, and something is going to be sent towards it. Whether it's a shot, whether it's I try and tee up an opposition, albeit maybe assists aren't quite his game. He did get one here for Mohamed Salah, probably more through luck than judgment of miscontrolling the ball that fell to Salah, who opportunistically was in the right place to sweep it in. But he is a guy who, as soon as he gets onto the pitch, just all of a sudden, he's like a one-man XG generation machine, isn't he?
He is exactly that, yeah. He's like a magnet, and his movements is arguably his best trait. I've been really impressed by his movements. His number of shots so far for Liverpool in the Community Shield friendlies and things like that, second half appearances, he's just really in the shots whenever he's on the pitch. As I said, he's like a magnet. He's just hoovering up these shots, and I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe we can put a note on this one, but I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the season he's got more non-penalty goals than Salah, just because of how much he's hoovering up the chances when he's on the pitch and how he's that central leading man. Just obsessed with Salah's got a lot more to his game than Nunez. Salah can create and progress the ball on deeper areas and things. I think Nunez is that finisher, and I think Klopp will use him like that.
So do you think Salah's game is going to change a bit with Nunez as well? I mean, Ian Doyle on our Blood Red podcast the other day was saying you forget Salah can cross a ball and how well he can do that with a player like Nunez in the team. All of a sudden, actually, is Salah's role maybe going to change a bit from become maybe a hybrid scorer and provider? I know he has registered a high volume of assists during his time at Liverpool already, but maybe not kind of classical assists that you think of, kind of feeding the ball into a main forward.
I think it has to change, yeah. I think he will naturally maybe spend a little bit more time out wide. He will probably naturally just become a little bit more of a creative source as opposed to being the man who finishes all the moves, because you've kind of got a man now in the team who will do that without doing much else almost. So if you actually look at Salah's game now, I mean, in that 40-minute spell with Nunez, inside something like the first 10, 15 minutes, he created the same chance for Nunez twice, identical. But one of them he scored. First one, the keeper made the save. But that early first-time ball from the wing to the near post, with Nunez already on his bike because he's anticipating it, looks like it's going to be, a new pattern of play, if you like, for Liverpool to use, considering just Nunez is just such an expert mover when he's off the ball, and he's so quick as well that he can just sneak in. And Salah's going to be threatening him behind and able to play those balls early because he's getting fed. So I think Liverpool will naturally change a little bit, and I can see Liverpool fielding the number 10 a little bit more because Nunez doesn't really drop much. So it's going to be interesting to see how things work. But I think considering his impact early on, I really don't think you can go into the Palace game with Nunez on the bench.
No, interesting. Let's talk about the midfield then. You said there with Nunez in the team, you can maybe see at number 10 coming into the play. I have to say I'm of the opposite mind. I think the 4-3-3 will be the way Liverpool continue to go, but perhaps, to feed into your point, not one number 10, but two in the two wide midfielders, especially if Thiago is out, that those two players either side of Fabinho really get high. Thiago, obviously, it's not his game. He does naturally sit deeper and pull the strings from there. But Jordan Henderson didn't have the greatest of games against Fulham, as we've already noted. It would probably be very risky and very high risk, high reward for Jurgen Klopp to go for, say, Elliott and Carvalho in the same team together from the off. But at home against Crystal Palace might well offer that opportunity. Equally, the likes of Naby Keita, who's in the squad, Curtis Jones as well. It does feel as though Liverpool do have the profile of player actually there, where they could play in a similar manner, a midfield setup to what Manchester City often do.
Yeah, it's a good shout actually. It's something that further down the line, maybe a bit more in the future when they've matured a little bit. Maybe you could see those two number 8s for Liverpool being a little bit like the early Pep teams with David Silva and Kevin De Bruyne, because they were naturally referred to as number 10s widely. You could probably say the same about Harvey Elliott and Carvalho, but they're both playing in number 8 roles at times. They're both teenagers as well. So maybe further down the line, they're going to move into those roles and become a bit more like that. But overall, I think Liverpool have options. Liverpool, there's different ways Liverpool can cope with Thiago's injury, but obviously a lot of the talk at the minute is to do with buying a new player, and I just find that talk a little bit frustrating personally. I think it's if you didn't think Liverpool needed a midfielder before Thiago's injury, you should probably think it now. It should be a case of Liverpool are getting a midfielder full stop, and regardless, basically. There's different ways to solve this in the squad.
Yeah, before discussing kind of the potential of a player coming in, there's a couple of names I want to put your way in that regard. But do you think the midfield, if it were to change with Nunez playing higher and effectively unlocking those two number 8s and letting them play higher, that would maybe actually enable Naby Keita to really show some consistency within his game? Because I'm not saying that Roberto Firmino has prevented that from happening, because he is able to link with him, but so many of the compilations, the highlight reels, what people were getting excited about Keita before he arrived at Liverpool from Leipzig was how he was all action around the midfield. Yet actually it feels as though maybe the midfield in which he came into, he was probably a little bit confined within. And if that midfield, the space opens up there, actually might see on a more consistent basis, because we've clearly seen over his time at Liverpool some great performances. It's just been a lack of consistency from him, and albeit a caveat, it would saying I know he's injured at this moment in time.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, Nunez's introduction will impact the dynamics in the midfield, just because he will play on the shoulder of opposing defenders. He will drag them back towards their own goal, and that will create space on the number 10 areas, basically. So there is naturally going to be space for Carvalho to use, Elliott, Thiago, Henderson, Keita, whoever it wants to be, in those kind of on the edge of the final third in the centre and half spaces and things like that. There's going to be space to use there. But in terms of Keita, I don't know. For me, he's a very high risk midfielder if you want to let him play his natural game. Because what his natural game is, or was at least at Leipzig when he was becoming this star, was he just kind of assumed possession in the middle of the park and just went and dribbled past everybody. And I think he's very good at doing it. And in the Bundesliga, obviously, he was deemed to be worth that risk, one of the team's main creators and things. But if you get him to do that in England, especially considering there's creative players around him in the team already in terms of like Trent and Salah and things like that, getting Keita to do that in the middle of the park when he could potentially lose the ball and immediately concede a counter-attack, I'm just never sure Klopp has really considered that to be worth it, considering you can take risks other ways in the team without really suffering from counter-attacks as easily. I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if Liverpool moves towards any kind of 4-2-3-1, because Keita did first emerge at Leipzig as part of a 2. And I think it might have been Diego Dem, I think is how you pronounce it. I think he was more of the holding player out of 2, and Keita was the man who occasionally joined the attack by carrying the ball forward. And I think if you put that in Liverpool context, it would be Fabinho sitting and Keita driving forward as part of a 2. But I don't know. It's going to be there's multiple ways this can go, really, isn't it?
Yeah, he's also obviously had 4 years at Liverpool now, hasn't he? And his injuries have probably taken their wear and tear on him in terms of that mobility, fluidity of quite jinking around players and slaloming his way around challenges. But which is one thing I wanted to kind of get your opinion on. But in terms of names, then you mentioned one solution that a lot of people were obviously jumping to was still in August, 20 days left of the transfer window. He's potentially bringing players in. Now, Mateus Nunez of Sporting Lisbon has been linked with the club. Is he the profile of midfielder that would suit into maybe the direction Liverpool are travelling? And another who really intrigues me is Nicolo Barella of Inter Milan.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised if Liverpool are interested in both of those players. I think the club do like both. I think, especially Barella. For some reason, the likes of Klopp and Mendes in particular seem to talk about Barella like he's our own player sometimes. But I think he's just got a bit difficult to acquire in terms of leaving Inter Milan, and I think he's on a fairly lengthy contract off the top of my head.
I think he's got 3 years left. I think.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe with players like that, it makes sense to wait until I've got 2 years left before making a move, just to save a bit of money, basically, like we seem to be doing with Bellingham. Nunez is another good player. I do like the look of him. I think he would probably be a sensible Liverpool target. Seems to be contracted until 2026, which is another 4 years. But the main is that he's got a release clause. Some people have said 40 million. Someone said 50. Someone said 60. So God knows what that is. But 23 years old, Portuguese league, which we know Liverpool are big fans of. Centre midfield, really capable, really well rounded. I can see Nunez, but I can't see. I believe the club basically when they say this summer, it's not going to happen. I believe what they're saying. I don't think it's a red flag or anything like that.
Yeah, no, Barella just looked at his contract. He's 26 as well, so 4 years left on his deal. So, as you previously said, those deals can be notoriously difficult to do. I mean, would it would leave Liverpool maybe with a bit of an undertaking next summer, obviously awaiting whether or not Naby Keita's going to sign a new contract. Harvey Elliott today has agreed a new contract with Liverpool. James Milner's into the final 12 months of his deal, so too is Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain. I mean, if Keita were to move on as well as Oxlade-Chamberlain and Milner at the end of the season, and that's all hypothetical, that would be 3 going out. Yes, it would probably create more room and more game time for the likes of Jones, Carvalho, and Elliott to absorb. But surely there's going to need to probably be at least 1, if not 2, additions in that midfield. And is that not quite some undertaking to do to a midfield, given it seems to be a midfield that is creaking at either age of the age spectrum? There's a number of players over 30 or around the 30 mark, and then there's a number of young kids. Do you see where I'm
Yeah,
coming from? It feels to me as though somebody needs to step in prime years of their career in there.
yeah. You need a player kind of in the middle, I suppose, don't you? Who's not quite a
Yeah,
teenager and not quite over the hill. Yeah, just to be clear, I do think Liverpool need a midfielder. That's pretty obvious. My big thing is just, first of all, I trust the club and how the club recruit. And my big thing has always been, if the right player isn't there, don't force it by going and getting somebody who is just going to plug a hole, basically, and rule you out of signing a better player in a future window, for example. Like if Liverpool were to go and get Ruben Neves off the top of my head,
yeah,
and that prevents you from getting Matthias Nunes next summer, or Nico Barella next summer, or Jude Bellingham next summer, I would rather Liverpool wait, personally, because over a long period of time, you are healthier and you are better if you have better players. So, although Liverpool might be a bit more kind of protected for the next season if they go and get a player like Neves or a midfielder from somewhere or whatever, it's just got to be the right player for me. Like a few weeks ago, Liverpool were linked with Sangare of PSV,
yeah.
and I spoke about how I think that could be a possibility. I've looked at him before. I like him. I can see him being Liverpool target and things. But Liverpool have obviously deemed him to be good, but not good enough for Liverpool or whatever, or the price hasn't been right or whatever. So if Liverpool aren't moving, in my opinion, it's probably for the right reason.
I mean, we'll have people listening to this screaming, saying, well, back on the 1st of January 2021, Liverpool were top of the Premier League at that time. They were, albeit City had 2 games in hand, they were a good 7 points clear of Manchester City at that point. So if they won their games in hand, there was only a point difference between the two sides, but they didn't strengthen the defence. They saw the defensive crisis get worse and then brought in the likes of Ozan Kabak and Ben Davies, who between them obviously didn't feature all too much. And in the end, it didn't really work out. Liverpool managed the situation to have parachuted even further down the league to rescue Champions League qualification, but never continued where they were at on New Year's Day, as I say, when that transfer window opened. But equally, in the long term, it did work out because they got the man they wanted in Ibrahima Konate. They put together another 90-plus point season, and they got to a Champions League final. They played every game they could have done. When I remember at the time, Sven Botman was the man that a lot of people were clamouring for Liverpool to go and sign. There was no guarantee that would have necessarily worked out.
Exactly. And, Liverpool, I think most fans would look at Konate and be like, okay, sound. Liverpool have got it right there. He's a top prospect, could be as good as he wants by the time he's 28, 27. He's going to be a top player. Liverpool got him for something like 35 million. Absolute snippet. Man United have just paid 50 million for a lad who's 5'9" at the back. Cucurella's just gone for 60 million. So Konate is a brilliant sign. So in that situation, the big thing is like people look at football on a season by season basis, and it's like a finite game. Like the world is going to end by the end of the season. So you make your transfers to protect you or to prepare you for that season alone almost. When in reality, football's an infinite game. Football keeps going. It's an ongoing experience. It's constant. So if Liverpool are still going to be playing football next year and the year after and the year after, it makes sense to just keep getting the right players in.
I know over the last few years we've spoken a lot about Manchester United and their poor recruitment and squad building. But this time last year, they went chips in on Varane, on Cristiano Ronaldo. Jadon Sancho had looked like it was as though their recruitment had been going towards getting smarter, and they'd finished second in the Premier League. But then all of a sudden, with two deals in Varane and Cristiano Ronaldo, and albeit fantastic players during their time at Real Madrid and had won a number of Champions Leagues together within that side, they weren't what that team needed. And albeit it was a very short-term experiment that Manchester United went for, and now very much paying the price for it, given, as you say, just how much they spent on Martinez last summer. They've, over the last 3 years, brought in Maguire, Varane and Martinez. There might be 4 seasons in those 3 where they brought in those players. I might be doing the Maguire deal a disservice in terms of actually when it was done. But you know the point I'm making in that regard of just how quickly they've gone through money, just throwing money at a problem when actually they're only exacerbating it rather than actually dealing with the situation they have.
Yeah, and when you get in these players, they just occupy spaces in the squad that a player from outside who you're also interested in, who's potentially better, could have occupied. So this is why it makes sense to just to always wait for the right man, essentially, to make the right sign every time. Because if you get it wrong, or if you sign a player who's all right, but he's not particularly great or anything like that, he's just occupying a space in your squad, and it just blocks. Like, say, for example, if Liverpool went and signed Timo Werner a few years ago, who is fine, by the way. I still think he's a good player. I think he would have done well at Liverpool. But if Liverpool went and signed Timo Werner a few years ago, Liverpool this summer probably wouldn't have went and got Nunez, because they both played through the middle, really. They're both kind of like the similar types in a way. So, Werner could have been good enough for us to never want Nunez, and Nunez might end up being a flop. God knows. But what I'm getting at is the transfers that you make now will have a massive impact on who you can get further down the line. And if I just don't want Liverpool to ever. Liverpool are in a too much of a healthy position right now to force it, like someone like Man United, for example. They clearly need players. That they are clearly desperate for a bit of an overhaul there. Liverpool, as much as people would argue against this, Liverpool are in a really healthy place at the moment. They've got a wealth of midfielders. They're just not always particularly fit, but there's a number of options in there. So I don't think Liverpool are in a position where they need to go and sign some form of stopgap like Saul Niguez, who joined Chelsea last season and just didn't do anything for a full season. I've never wanted Liverpool to go down that route personally.
No, you'd rather see someone like Carvalho maybe pushed in a little bit earlier than expected, but knowing he's got the quality to deal with it, to actually see if he does develop a bit quicker than perhaps expected. But before we go, let's talk about the game on Monday night. Crystal Palace heading to Anfield, the first home game of the Premier League season for Liverpool. Josh, Palace obviously opened up the Premier League season being beaten by Arsenal at Selhurst Park. What are you expecting from them? They seem a bit of a different proposition from last season, given Colin Gallagher, who was such an influential part of their midfield, is now back at Chelsea.
Yeah, well, I do like Palace, I'll be honest. I think they're a top club, and I think the recruitment that they generally are doing since probably last summer has been really good. I like the players that they've got in terms of the core, especially. I watched the game against Arsenal. I thought they were okay. I thought Arsenal probably deserved to win. I'm not sure it was a 2-0. I thought Palace might have snuck one. I thought Anderson was very good at the back. Really impressed with him, and those long diagonal passes in the direction of Zaha could cause a problem for Trent in those, because it'll result in 1v1s really, and Zaha's difficult to deal with 1v1. I mean, have you got any info to pass on, mate? I'm sure you was a keen watcher of the game.
Yeah, no, in terms of what they did, I thought.
Do you think it was a deserved 2-0?
I do, because I think first half I thought Arsenal were in complete domination until
Yeah.
Aaron Ramsdale just changed the course of the game, dwelling on a pass back to him just before half time. Palace came into it. Second half, I thought Palace had a lot of the ball, but I thought Arsenal shepherded them round the pitch very well. I'm struggling to really note and remember any clear cut opportunities for Palace where you thought, right, that was where they could have got the goal. I'm a keen believer teams can control a ball without a game by shepherding the opposition around the pitch. And I thought with Saliba at the back, I thought Arsenal did that expertly well. But in terms of Palace, I think that clinical edge at the top end of the pitch is maybe something they miss. I think they have the chaos factor with Jean-Philippe Mateta, but I don't think at Anfield he'll probably, should Van Dijk and Matip look after him correctly, won't really be able to get into the game. I think Odsonne Edouard is decent without really fully convincing at that top end of the pitch. And as you say, I think the danger man is Wilfried Zaha, and I think Trent Alexander-Arnold will be able to really lay to rest that idea that he's not a great one-on-one defender. Trent Alexander-Arnold is also a fantastic covering defender. Any balls put into space, he often wins the foot race, and he's the last man back there for Liverpool, which is something that I think a lot of people just forget and conveniently forget about his defensive abilities. I remember a couple of years ago, it was James Milner up against Zaha, wasn't it? And that was a torrid afternoon for James Milner. I remember reading his book, and he even wrote in that Zaha's kind of the best one-on-one player he's come up against for a long, long time, and really did struggle that day. But I think Liverpool have enough to contain and control the threats Palace have. And it'll be a case of seeing what that midfield is without Thiago, and just seeing how Liverpool go about breaking them down. I mean, without wanting to be disrespectful, I personally, I don't know about you, but would be expecting Liverpool to come out with a point to prove, and therefore should lead to something you would hope that would be fairly routine under the lights at Anfield as well. The crowd should really be up for it.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to say. I think it's maybe a little bit cliche, but you would expect a massive response in comparison to Fulham. Klopp was not happy in any way, shape, or form. The players won't have been either. So I do expect a reaction. I think Nunez will get his proper Anfield debut. As you say, it'll be a night game, so there'll be plenty of atmosphere around the game. City might even be 5 points clear of Liverpool already by the time that game comes down. He probably will be, considering they've got Bournemouth at the Etihad. So it's obviously daft to start talking about must-win games already, but you just can't be letting Pep Guardiola especially steal a march on you so early. So this is quite an important game, really. I mean, I rate Palace. Liverpool did not win the first game when they should have. City are probably going to go into this Palace game with 2 wins behind them. So it's quite an important game, and Liverpool needs to be really on it in this match.
What would you do with the midfield? Just out of interest, what would you? Obviously, Thiago's injured. News flash. I mean, I wouldn't expect Liverpool to have anyone signed or thrown straight into the team, even if it were to happen. But it will be the options they've got. Keita obviously has been suffering, seems to be carrying a knock himself, and Thiago out as well. Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain on the injury list already too. So maybe not all too many options, but probably is it a straight shootout between Carvalho and Elliott?
Well, this is a different one. This because there's so many different elements to the game that I'm weighing up in my head. So I would be really tempted to go 4-2-3-1 because we now don't have Thiago. I think Henderson is probably a better 6 than a 8. And if he was to play in a 4-2-3-1, he would be allowed to just kind of play within his limitations almost. Liverpool have Carvalho, Elliott, and Firmino as 10 options, and Nunez doesn't drop into those spaces. So I think I'm at home. So I think the option for 4-2-3-1 is right there now. Having said that, Zaha is a problem, and you're probably going to have to double up on him. And if you're doubling up on him, that means you probably want number 8s on the pitch so that Henderson can kind of shuffle over basically and support Trent. The issue with that is if Henderson kind of then probably has to play on that side, which means that the left side of the midfield spot where Thiago usually plays is going to be the one that's open, and that's the one that Elliott doesn't usually occupy. Elliott usually plays on Salah's side of the pitch. So maybe it's going to be Carvalho, considering that. Maybe it's going to be exactly the same as Fulham, but Carvalho in place of Thiago. But then you have, I like the thought of Elliott playing. You know, is it a coincidence that he's just got a new contract? That maybe it's a bit of a kind of like a you're the man now type thing.
On the 4-2-3-1 shout with Thiago not playing as well, and I know it's a nuance, but that's what we're here to do, is talk about those nuances. Is how much of a difference do you think it would be though for Fabinho, who has taken not so long, but for so long now at Liverpool after transitioning for a while, getting used to playing as a single pivot, going into a double pivot? If Thiago's there, I get it. He can occupy that left-hand side of the pitch. Moving out to the left is natural to him. That's what he does in the 4-3-3. But if it's Henderson and Fabinho, which one of those are you putting on the left-hand side of the partnership? And is that part of their natural game? And does it affect the defensive structure or even the attacking progression of getting the play started, of just drifting out to that side and supporting Robertson or occupying those areas of the pitch?
Yeah, I think Fabinho will generally be okay personally. You know, he does have a few years behind him playing in the double pivot, and although it would mean he's now playing with a partner, his actual role wouldn't change that much in terms of he would still occupy those deeper areas, provide a bit more of a governing figure from deep, just putting out fires and things like that and letting other players play. It'd almost be a bit more of a change for Henderson, really, because Henderson would go from, occupying high spaces in the final third, box to box, little bit of responsibility to create. He'd go from that to kind of just overseeing everybody else do their thing in the final third almost. So, but having said that, I think the two of them could operate as a pair, and I think Liverpool will be fine. Maybe for this game in particular, if you do that, maybe you put Fabinho on the right side of the pairing because that's the side that Zaha's on, so it's more threatening, obviously. But I'm not sure if Palace are playing with a number 10 at the minute. In Eze, is Eze playing as number 10 or is he playing as an 8? Because if he's playing as a 10, that'd mean he'd play right behind a double pivot for Liverpool, which I suppose could be a problem. But these are all the things that Klopp has to weigh up in his decision making. But it's not ideal that Thiago's out, but there is plenty of internal ways of solving this. I'm just not really sure what he'll go for.
Yeah, so Palace, Eze did play as a 10 against Arsenal. They had Jeffrey Schlupp and Doucouré is kind of deeper midfield players, albeit Schlupp was kind of shuttling around and trying to get up and support Eze in building attacks, and Doucouré was kind of anchoring that midfield. But yeah, it will be interesting. Right, before we wrap up then, prediction time, Josh. What's the score going to be?
I do rate Palace, but I think after Liverpool's start, I think they almost have no choice but to be right on it for this game. So I'm going to say 3-0. But
Yeah,
I wouldn't have said that if Liverpool won last week.
Yeah, I'm going to say 2-0. I think it will. I think Liverpool will do it. I think they'll just have too much for Palace in the end, and we will have to wait and see how that does.
Who are you going to captain, mate?
The Egyptian king, and not you told me earlier, not Jesus. Lesson learned.
Okay.
Don't captain Jesus. There is again for those watching, and I'll read it out for those listening. Our Analysing Anfield Fantasy Premier League code is 8S72G1. It will also be in the description if you do want to join, albeit as a latecomer. We are looking to see if we can get the league up to 500 people, and by the end of the season, see if I can finish in 500th place. We'll have to wait to see if that is how things do play out. But for myself, Guy Clarke, and Josh Williams, thanks for joining us on this edition of Analysing Anfield. Until next time, it's bye for now.